Hello everyone and welcome to the 2018 World Chess Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. For those of you who are just tuning in to the championship or are perhaps new to this channel, 9 previous games have been drawn. It is a pretty long drawing streak, but it's not that the games are boring or anything. It's simply both players are fighting on very equal grounds and they are both extremely precise in the moves they make. So this is game 10. If you remember in game 8 where Caruana also had the white pieces, he prepared a very nasty surprise against Carlsen's Lasker variation of the Sicilian that included a very nice b4 advance of the pawn. Grigori Oparin also used that at some point to beat Boris Gelfand. Caruana improved on that game, but still a very rare line that Carlsen was prepared for, but not all that much. Here, of course, Carlsen is definitely preparing, expecting that line, so it's very interesting what he prepared for it. Before we check out the actual game, I do have a short announcement. If you remember a month ago or maybe 2 months ago, I told you that an artist from Chile, Huga, she made a song about Capablanca, about one of his games, and that you should check out her song and try to figure out which game she was talking about. And that was a bit of a blunder by me because the song was actually about her own game and she was just talking about Capablanca in that game. But now she released another song. It's called Isolated Pawn, so also chess related. The first thing you'll see in the description below is a link to her song, and in that song she actually sings about a very famous game between two very famous chess players. So if you feel like it, do check it out. The link leads to the song on her channel, and try and figure out the game. For those of you who watch my videos up until the last second, I will also include her invitation at the end of this video. So before we dive into the game, we do have a couple of very nice photos, also compliments of Niki Riga, so let's check it out. Here is Magnus Carlsen arriving at the table. You can see that Caruana is still not here, so perhaps taking the Fischer approach, maybe being late for a game. It's very hard to say, or Magnus was just very early. Also, we have a very nice photo of the actual handshake when Caruana arrived, so you can see that Carlsen is trying to get up, but he wasn't just in time. So it's perhaps a semi-diagonal handshake, and also notice that there is no eye contact whatsoever. Both of them are just staring at nothing. So seems to be a very important maneuver, not to be at all at friendly terms with your opponent. Also, here is a very nice photo of Carlsen. He seems to be fed up with Niki taking photos of him, so he's just like beat it. And also here we have a very nice photo of Caruana, who is obviously of a similar mind, as there are so many photos of them that are of high quality, and they have to really come prepared for that. Also, here we have a very nice photo of this gentleman making the first move for Fabiano. So also as a photo challenge, we can guess who this person is making the first move for Fabiano. And for last, here is a very nice photo of the handshake before the actual game starts. Again, you can see there is no eye contact, and well, as Caruana mentioned in one of the interviews after the game, he really barely even looks at Magnus during the game. So that being said, let's check out what happened in this game. Caruana has the white pieces and he opens with e4, much like in game 8. Carlsen replies with c5, so the Sicilian defense is on the board. Knight to f3, knight to c6, and d4, so the open Sicilian is on the board. C captures, knight to f6, knight to c3, and e5. Exact same order of moves that was played in game 8. Knight d to b5, and now d6. So the Lasker variation is on the board. Knight to d5, knight captures, pawn captures, and now knight to b8, the most frequently played move in this position. And here we already mentioned this during game 8. In the past, c4 was the main idea here. Now a4 is the line pretty much everyone plays here. Bishop to e7, Carlsen continues in the same fashion that he played game 8. We have bishop to e2, and now comes castles by Carlsen. Caruana also castles. We have knight to d7, and here, if you remember, Well, there are a lot of moves possible here. A5 is definitely possible here. Immediately retreating with the knight to c3 is possible. The move Caruana played in game 8 is bishop to d2, where he prepares the bishop to guard the pawn, and after the knight is attacked, the knight can actually come to a3, and the pawn will already be protected on a5. But here, it's actually Caruana who deviates again from the game, because he goes for the immediate... well, not f5 was the move played by Carlsen in game 8. But here, b4 is the move Caruana prepared for this game. So he doesn't go for bishop to d2 at all, but rather goes for this very early queenside expansion. And Carlsen was very shaken by this. He started spending a lot of time, again, as he didn't really take this move into consideration when he was preparing and looking for improvements. So any improvements he may have found on game 8 were no longer viable after Caruana makes his 12th move, that is b4. So here, after some 12 minutes, Carlsen continues with a6. We have knight back to a3, and now Carlsen continues with a5, which seems to be a bit odd, because, okay, you can maybe play a5 immediately, but not really, as then you allow the knight to stay on b5. Now, by playing a6, knight moves, and only now going a5, now bringing the knight back to such an active square like b5 would be not all that great. Here, you can simply capture a pawn, and okay, you will most likely win the pawn back after bishop to d2. But after knight c5, bishop captures, knight a6, you are perhaps allowing black too much activity. So, after a5, we have bishop b captures on a5, and now comes rook captures on a5. Knight to c4, forcing Carlsen's rook to move back. We have rook to a8, and now comes bishop to e3. Again, using similar ideas like in game 8, you want to push this pawn to a5 and create a very nice outpost on b6 for your pieces, and perhaps keep this rook on a8 undeveloped for a very long time. And here, Carlsen actually decides again to go for this f5 move. He could have gone for something like b6, but then rook to b1 is actually a very powerful idea. After rook captures on a4, you can go knight captures on b6, and now you will not be able to capture on b6 because of bishop captures attacking the queen, and after the queen moves, bishop to b5, losing the exchange, as now both the queen and the rook are under attack. So what you could do after knight captures on b6, you could play rook a3, but still your rook would be forced to run around the board, and well, that's just too much, and now you have to capture with the knight, because bishop to b6 is a threat. You have to capture with the queen, and now after something like f3, black is most likely alright, but you know, it's for something you're unprepared, you definitely don't want to dance around the board, and especially if you're already out of the book on move 12. So we have f5 by Carlsen, and now comes a5 by Caruana, as planned. And here Carlsen pushes f4. A lot of people were saying that maybe this early advance is a bit too early, but Sese actually agrees with Carlsen's assessment of f4. And here we have bishop to b6. If you play a move without a tempo, like this comes with an attack on the queen, if you play something slow like bishop to d2, then even e4 is possible, and now you're already controlling a lot of squares here. It's hard to say whether this would work or not, but there's no need to allow it. So Caruana goes bishop to b6. He attacks Carlsen's queen, and now you have queen to e8. Also possible is knight captures on b6, but it's not at all great, because after knight captures, your rook is under attack, and after you move the rook, now comes the bishop to g4. And after bishop captures, queen captures, you have this very strong knight on b6, your rook is terrible on a7, and the queen is very strong here, controlling this very important e6 square, so it's a bit too much to allow white to have. So, after attacking Carlsen's queen with bishop to b6, Carlsen goes queen to e8, and now, after spending some 17 minutes here, Caruana definitely had to figure out a lot of ideas. One of them was bishop to c7. Do you immediately go for this d6 pawn? But then Carlsen can simply defend it with queen to g6. Other ideas involved something like bishop to h5, attacking the queen, because the queen really has no retreat squares. So here you would have to weaken your king by playing g6, and then after white retreats back, you would basically waste a move here and back with the bishop, but at least you would prevent black from playing queen to g6, so the queen will be pretty poorly placed on on e8, and also you've weakened the black's king side a bit. But is it really worth it to tempi? It's again hard to say. One very nice move, but it's a move suggested by a computer, is actually rook to e1. You're simply waiting for black to play queen to g6, and as black really has no better moves after queen to g6, now you will play bishop to d3, develop this bishop with an attack against the queen, and after queen to g5, play f3, prevent any advancement of Carlsen's pawns, but still, even though Caruana most likely considered this, it's a hard decision to make. I mean, you're also weakening your king side, and you can't really claim that you're better. This rook can come into the game, the queen can also threaten all sorts of nasty ideas on the king side. So with 17 minutes of considering, Caruana plays rook to a3, and it's a very nice move. The rook will most likely be able to come help out with the defense of the third rank, and perhaps if maybe even attack against Carlsen's king comes, then perhaps the rook will also be able to help out with that. Here we have queen to g6. Carlsen simply brings the queen into the game, but he had to decide whether he wants to start a kingside attack with rook to f6, maybe bring the rook over to h6 and start an attack, but then you would have to make some different squares for your queen. You would have to bring the queen to f8, queen to f6 again, and then maybe queen to h4. He decides that queen to g6 is just better and quicker. And here we have bishop to c7. Caruana now goes for the d6 pawn, and there is a lot of pressure against it now. Also possible ideas were again rook to b3 and rook to e1. Rook to e1, it's definitely an important move that you'll see will be an idea for the rest of the game, because you do want to play rook e1 and bring this bishop to f1 to help out with the protection of the g2 square and h3 if needed. But okay, bishop to c7 was played. A lot of pressure is now against this d6 pawn. For now, it is protected, but you know, the white queen can get attacked at any point. And here, after some 17 minutes, Carlsen plays e4. E4, he decides there was also a very nice idea that included the move b5, but b5 is not an easy move to make. Here your knight is under attack, and you have to capture. A captures on b6. After you capture, rook captures, knight captures, and now after your knight is on a3, only now you push e4, as you've taken care of pretty much everything on the queen side. The knight is somewhat displaced on a3, and only now will you continue with your attack. But it's really not all that clear. After bishop to h5, attacking Carlsen's queen, queen moves. Now white will be able to go queen to g4, and here you will either trade queens or you will capture queen captures on d5, but then comes c4. A very nice move. After queen e5, now you get b7. This is the idea, because now you have to capture, and the knight on d7 is unprotected. Bishop captures, queen captures, and now after e3 we get this really crazy line where white is, as you can see, up a whole knight, but black has this very nice attack, and it's very hard to actually decide to go for this. So Carlsen, instead of this immediate b5, first plays e4, and now Caruana goes king to h1. He doesn't want to allow his king to be on this diagonal, and also perhaps rook to g1 will be an idea in the future. But now, after some 15 minutes of consideration, Carlsen does play b5. He thinks that now, with the pawn already on e4, it will be a much better variation. And Caruana definitely does give this some consideration, as he should, as it's really a super complicated line. I've seen a lot of live commentaries where not a lot of people understood why a captures on b6 was not good, and in fact Caruana did play knight to b6, but here I will just show a line by Sese, because it's simply too crazy and it leads to all sorts of sorcery. If a captures, then you get rook captures on a3, and after knight captures on a3, then comes f3. Of course, you want to start attacking, you're threatening checkmate on g2. Queen captures on g2. G captures, we have knight to e5 now. Rook to g1 attacks the queen, queen to h6, and now comes queen to c1, offering a queen trade, but now comes queen to h5. Black, of course, wants to avoid trading queens, and he wants to checkmate the white king. Queen to e3, and now knight captures on f3. the threat is queen captures here. And now if you capture with the bishop, then the rook will capture, comes with an attack on the queen, and with the two bishops and the rook and the queen, black will have a very ugly attack. So here white would have to go something like rook to g2 to defend the h2 pawn, but now comes bishop to h3. Rook to g3 and now bishop to g4. Again, black is threatening checkmate, queen captures on h2, and after white defends once again, now comes bishop to g5, attacking white's queen, queen captures, and now comes rook to d8. Queen captures, and now rook captures on e2, and now you cannot capture the queen because you're getting checkmated. Rook g1, rook captures on g1 will be checkmate, and if you don't capture the queen, if you go for queen to c8 check with the idea of promoting your own pawn, then you get rook e8. Now there is no checkmate, but now b7. And after bishop to d8, now there is again a threat of rook to e1 checkmate will follow after rook g1 is blocked with. Bishop to a5, preventing rook to e1, but now queen h6, preparing queen to c1. Queen g4, now rook to g1 will be able to block, but still queen c1 check, rook blocks, knight captures, and now bishop to d2, a very important move. Queen has to capture, and now comes b8, bringing another queen into the game. Knight to h3, preparing rook to e1, but now queen to e6 check. Rook captures, and now an in-between move. Queen captures on d8 with check, king here, now pawn captures with check, king moves, and here you would have this position where black is just better because white does have a passed pawn on almost ready to come to e7, but his knight on a3 is a bit misplaced, and you don't really have the option of playing this because you're just getting checkmated by black. Queen here, and then after this you're white is checkmated. So here white wouldn't really have any good ideas. King g2 would have to be played, and then after knight captures, black will simply continue the king hunt and most likely win this game. So this is a truly crazy line after that Carlsen started with b5, but Caruana managed to avoid it. He did not go for a captures on b6, but still it's a like, you know, definitely if this happened it would go straight into the sorcery series. Knight to b6 was played, and here we have knight captures on b6. Bishop captures, and now b4 was supposed to be played, but Carlsen actually decided to sacrifice a pawn, and he played queen to g5. If you go b4 here, that saves your pawn, then rook to b3 attacks the pawn, and now bishop to f6 will be quite annoying, threatening bishop to c3. And now if rook captures, you're still gonna play bishop to c3. Now you have to go rook to a4 to defend the a5 pawn, but still after bishop to d7 attacking the rook, you will at some point have to move the rook, and now black will simply win back the pawn and pretty much equalize everything. So here Carlsen decides he doesn't want to go into this. He decides to sacrifice a pawn. He plays queen to g5, and this is only move 23, so Caruana is about to make his move 24, and he's spending a lot of time. Carlsen also was spending a lot of time, but it's not an easy decision. Can you actually capture this pawn here? Here Caruana took some 18 minutes to decide on his next move because, well, obviously you are gonna face a terrible attack. You have to calculate what happens after e3, what happens after f3, what happens if bishop comes to h3, what happens if rook f6, rook h6, and queen h4 going for a straight out mating attack. Can white stop this? And do you in all this madness have time to actually be a pawn grabber? Well, let's just check a couple of nicer ones. For example, if you play f3, which is also a possibility, then you get e3, simply advancing the pawn, and now g3. This is what Caruana also mentioned in the press conference. That was his idea. Perhaps he could play this, but then after captures, rook to g1, simply as the queen is pinned. The pawn is pinned and the queen is on g5. After queen moves, you will capture here, and now after bishop to g5, defending the e3 pawn, queen g1. And now after bishop here, now comes this very nice bishop captures on e3. You cannot capture the rook as the queen would be hanging on h6. So bishop captures, rook captures on a5. And now we enter this rook e7. The threat is rook captures on g7, so now rook to f7. Captures, we have queen to b6, and now rook to a1, king g2. And here we have this position that has pretty much settled down and would most likely result in some sort of a draw. On the other hand, after queen to g5, if Caruana grabbed the pawn, He said that this was most likely too greedy, you don't want to do this, how do you defend against checkmate? But if black actually goes for checkmate with something like rook to f6, then you have this rook to e1. This is a very important move, and after rook to g6, you can go simply bishop back to f1. So as I mentioned, this is a theme, rook e1 with bishop to f1, that's very important. f3, you have g3, and now your bishop is guarding this diagonal, and it will be hard for black to break through. And he does have things to worry about himself. But you know, it's a World Chess Championship game. You don't want to allow such a brutal attack for just one pawn. So after queen to g5, g3 was played by Caruana. And here, most likely this came as a surprise to Magnus, as it did to everyone else. Because how do you continue here? Carlsen played b4. And it's most likely the way to go. If you play something like f3, then bishop can capture on b5. And now what do you play here? If you try queen to h5 with some ideas of queen h3 followed by checkmate, they will simply be met with rook e1. The bishop can still come and defend with f1. If queen comes, then bishop to f1, and nothing good is happening here for black. On the other hand, if you try something like rook to f6 now to bring the rook into the game, then rook e1. And then after queen to f5, bishop will again come to f1, and again black really doesn't have any ways of pursuing this. So after this g3 move, we have b4 as we mentioned, and now comes rook to b3. Again, a lot of people were mentioning that instead of rook to b3, you should play the in-between g captures on f4. Simply attack Carlsen's queen, and after queen captures, rook to g3, which now would give white a lot of room here. But after bishop to h4, of course, black will not allow you to calmly double rooks on the g file. Now comes queen to d4, a very nice move, and now after bishop captures, pawn captures, the queen has to move. Queen moves, and now rook captures on f8. King captures, and now we have queen captures on e4. But after bishop to h3, it seems that Carlsen assessed the position correctly, and Caruana both. Now black is simply up the exchange, even though white has two very powerful bishops and a passed pawn and already on a5, black would have the advantage here. So after b4, we have rook to b3, not going for this in-between move, and bishop to h3 by Carlsen. Again, if you try f3 now, which is definitely a possibility, bishop can again come to b5, even though now doesn't come with a capture. Rook to f6, rook to e1, now after queen to g4, going for mate, bishop to f1, and after rook to h6, again bishop to e3, attacking the rook. And after g5, black will most likely have the upper hand here, but still there is no clear way of actually finding a decent plan here for black. So it's not at all easy thing to decide to do. So instead of f3, first Carlsen played bishop to h3, attacking the rook. We have rook to g1. Rook to g1 is better than rook to e1. If you go rook to e1, then ideas like bishop to f6 to c3 will be possible, where you will either defend this pawn indirectly, because this will come with a double attack on the rooks, but the rook g1 is just better. And here, after some 15 minutes, Carlsen played f3, and here Carlsen had 15 minutes on the clock, whereas Caruana had 18, so definitely both are really draining their clock. Bishop to f1, bishop captures, and here we have queen captures. It might seem a better idea to capture with the rook so the queen can keep an eye on the d5 pawn, but then rook to f5 will still just pick it up, and black will now even be better, because the rook on f1 is not really doing all that much, and the queen will have to move from the d file. After bishop captures on f1, we have queen captures on f1, queen captures on d5, and now rook captures on b4. Queen to e6, and now comes rook to b5. Rook to b5 is a super cool move by Fabi. Everyone thought that he will play c4 to simply prevent d5, because now if you, of course, play d5, yes, the bishop does attack the rook, but there's the in-between move that attacks the queen. And now after queen captures, rook d4 will be very strong. Queen e6, if you want to keep an eye on this pawn, but now simply queen to b1, defends everything, and now rook captures will be a huge threat. But on the other hand, if c4, then bishop to g5 is a very strong move. Instead of If c4 was played, then bishop to g5 would have been very strong, but like Fabi decided to do, rook to b5 will protect the g5 square. So here, if he actually allowed this, then the threat of e3 would be perhaps somewhat advantageous to black. But he decided to go rook to b5, he decided to keep an eye on the g5 square, and here Carlsen played bishop to d8. You have to decide whether you want to play this or you want to go after the c pawn, but even then the queen will come to b1 and everything will be fine. You will even just improve the position of the white queen. So first bishop to d8, we have queen to e1, not allowing this pawn to ever to come to e3. Caruana will definitely put his queen either to e3 or d4 to control this very important diagonal as much as he can. Bishop captures, we have a captures on b6, and now rook 8 to b8. Here we have queen to e3 as planned, and now comes queen to c4. Here also, if you try something like rook to f6 and you play b7, this is just to show you that the position is not without any danger. For example, if something like queen to h3 is played and Fabi isn't careful, play something like queen to h7, goes after the rook, then there is no need for something like this, because there is a very nice tactic. Queen captures on h2, king captures, and rook to h6 will now be checkmate, because the rook is simply in the way of the king's retreat square, and this pawn is covering g2. So now after this rook blocks, it will be a very nice checkmate. But okay, after queen e3, queen c4, we have rook back to b2, defending the b2 pawn, and now comes rook to b7. Here Carlsen had 3 minutes and Caruana had 7, and they still had to make 6 more moves to reach time control. Rook to d1, going after the d6 pawn, and now comes queen to e2, a move Carlsen missed, Fabiano missed, that really packs a lot of poison to it. Because now, well, there's a whole lot of danger here. For example, if you play something like queen to d4, then you get this very unpleasant e3 move, and now there's really not all that much you can do here. You cannot capture with the queen because the rook would be hanging, and of course you don't want to allow black to capture here. And on the other on the other hand, if pawn captures here, then queen to g2 will be checkmate. So this is one such poison, and the other one is actually even greater. If queen to b3 check, king moves, and now c4, it seems that Caruana has now trapped Carlsen's queen, but this is the problem, and this is the trick Carlsen had in mind. Now comes rook captures on b6, and now white is lost. Whatever you play, let's say rook captures here, now you first play pawn captures rook, and now you're also threatening to capture on d1. So after queen a4, you definitely want to keep an eye on that rook on d1. Now comes rook to a6, a very important move, and after queen moves, only now you capture. Queen captures, and now after rook captures on f2, the two rooks against the queen are so winning that it's impossible to play this with white. After white tries any move, of course you will protect against checkmate, but then after something like king g1, e3 is coming, and now after this, now everything pretty much results in checkmate. After queen e3, you will simply play rook to e2, and now either the queen will move and then rook to a1 is checkmate, or queen will block the a1 square, but then rook e1 will be checkmate. So queen e2, a move that really packs a lot of poison, but Caruana responds properly. Rook to e1. And now you really don't have any options, you have to trade queens. We have queen captures, rook captures, and now d5. We have h4 by Caruana, the best move, giving your king some breathing space. You don't want to allow any back rank weaknesses as the g2 square is covered, so ideas like rook a7 to a1 will also be possible. So first, h4. Rook to c8 by Carlsen, trying to put pressure against the c2 pawn, and now comes rook to a3. A very nice defense Caruana found. We have king to f7, and now comes move number 40, king to h2. Caruana has reached time control, and Carlsen, by playing king to e6, also reaches time control. We have g4 by Caruana, rook to c6 with a double attack against the b6 pawn, and now comes rook to a6. A better idea than this rook to b3 move, where white's rooks would be very passive, and then after h6, black's position will just be very nice. Here after rook to a6, I think I've heard Giri mention that this is, although it seems like a more passive square, white always keeps the option of playing this rook to a7. So king to e5 by Carlsen, and now you don't want to allow this king to come to f4, so king to g3. We have h6, h5, and now here Carlsen spent 13 minutes because he has to decide what to do here. He can either play g5, which will pretty much draw by force, but we can even show it. Just a second. For this video, I even prepared a glass of water. Very nice. So king d4 was played in the game, but Carlsen could have played g5 immediately, but that would force a draw. After h captures, rook captures, rook to b5. We have h5, and now rook to a5 with a double attack against the d5 pawn. King to f6, rook captures, but now rook captures on g4. King to h3, rook captures on b6, and now rook captures on h5. And now, although it seems like a very strong position, for example, after rook to g2, white king is really down in the corner, but you will never have time to play something like rook g1 and rook h1 checkmate, because white will simply not allow it. Rook h6 check. Now you can't move the king because you're going to lose the rook, so you have to block it, and now after this exchange, it's simply 2 against 2, a very drawn endgame. So Carlsen decided he is not interested in drawing this just yet. He decided to go adventure mode with king to d4. And here Caruana pretty much not immediately, because they are no longer in time trouble, they've reached time control, played rook to b5, and this move Carlsen says that he missed because now, well, you're only going to run into trouble if you capture on c2, then rook to a5 is coming, and you don't want to allow white to capture on d5 while your king is on d4. So here one option would be to go king to c4, but this is again a line by Sese. It seems very inhuman to come this close into the action with your king, and then after rook a to a5, rook captures on b6, and then only rook captures on d5. But still, you don't want your king all the way here. So instead, Carlsen played rook to d6, and now we have rook to a4 check. King moves, and now comes king to b4, defending the b6 pawn once again. King e6, now comes c4, pawn captures, rook captures, and now rook captures on e4 with check. King to f7, we have rook to f5 check, and here Caruana here could have tried to play it differently, but he said that after calculating everything out, he decided everything was a draw, which is the correct assessment. Rook to f5 was played, rook to f6, captures, and here king captures on f3. Caruana is up a pawn, but this is a theoretical draw, and Caruana is more than convinced that Carlsen is able to play this out to a draw. King f7 was played, and after king to g3, on move 54, the players agreed to a draw. So there we have it. That was game 10, a very, very intense game that featured a lot of possibilities, and I don't think that it's even possible to make a video about this book, as it features so many lines, so many crazy ideas. You could easily make like a 3-hour video, or write an entire book perhaps about this game, because it really has everything. So if you are new to this match or new to this channel, you can see that even though the game ended in a draw, it was pure sorcery draw. So yeah, and like I've promised, for those of you who have come till the end of the video, we also have a video invitation from Huga herself to check out her video and try to solve her challenge. So here it is. It's a very short invitation, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's check it out.
I'm Huga, a songwriter and
artist
from
load
Chile.
My hard
I'm also
drive. Sorry about that.
Hi everyone, I'm Huga, a songwriter and artist from Chile. I'm also a chess lover, and I'm in London watching the Chess World Championship and about to release my new chess music video called Isolated Pawn. Actually, Miss Anna Rudolph is filming this video.
Hello everyone.
The Isolated Pawn video includes a chess sequence inspired in a famous game. Can you find out which is the game that inspired this chess sequence? You can check out the video at my YouTube channel, Huga, or at hugamusica.com. Hope you enjoy it.
So yeah, there you have it. The link to her video will be the first thing you will see in the description below. Feel free to check out her challenge. Best of luck to you. I would like to thank Antonio Colonello, Jersey Lapa, Munardazi Nyahavu, Glenn Brock, and Norman Stone Lee, or Norman Stone III, for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully I will see you soon with another interesting video. But yeah, how do you like the match so far? And I mean, what is your opinion of this game? Is it pure sorcery or what? But yeah, thank you all, and I will see you soon.